Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome back for another episode of From the Editor's Desk, where, together with my friend and colleague Kyle Brasseur, editor-in-chief at Compliance Week, we unpack some of the top stories which will appear or have appeared in Compliance Week. This week, or this episode, we'll take a deep dive into inside the mind of the CCO, as well as talk some sports and generally try to solve the world's problems. I'm your co-host, Tom Fox.
And I'm Kyle Brasseur. Tom, it's great to be back here. And you mentioned before we went on this podcast, this is our 25th episode. I'm going to count that as a milestone because that means you've put up with me now for 25 times. That's a big accomplishment on your end.
We can't say I put up with you for 25 because we started with your predecessor.
Yeah, so you put up with him.
Him and you. So maybe it's double trouble.
Yeah, it sounds like you're working overtime, Tom.
So Kyle, we had, first of all, never take off a 3-day work week to move, because in the space of 3 days or 4 days, we had one of the biggest corporate governance brouhahas of recent years with OpenAI board firing Sam Altman and him eventually coming back. Number one. Number two, we had 2 FCPA enforcement actions. Number 3, we had an FCPA declination. And number 4, we had the largest crypto penalty enforcement action in the history of the world ever. And that was just 3 days. So I don't know if you want to unpack those 3 days or you have other stories, but why don't you give us your highlights from November, Kyle?
Yeah, and it's funny because the way I always look at holiday weeks, especially from a news perspective, is, it's going to be quiet. The regulators they're not going to do their splashy stuff at a time when people are distracted, but they love to surprise. And I think that Bianace action, it was one of those rare cases where we knew what was going to happen before it happened. Usually you find out things as they happen, but that was one where there was a lot of momentum leading toward it earlier in the day. So we were able to wrap our heads around it, but just such a significant case, even going beyond crypto. The problems at the end of the day were just core issues. They did not have anti-money laundering policies in place like they were supposed to. They did not have sanctions compliance programs in place like they were supposed to. So it wasn't really a crypto issue. It was just a company that had no regard whatsoever for compliance. And I think the DOJ's sentencing documents said it best, in that it was a paper program. And that's why we also saw the chief compliance officer getting penalized as well. The first time the CFTC has brought an individual enforcement against the chief compliance officer, just because at the end of the day, it was a paper position based on the allegations anyway. When I saw that case come down, I thought about it. Usually when we cover crypto stuff, sometimes it can be a little written off as well as the crypto sector. But I think this Bianace one is really unique. And I think the way that our audience has been paying attention to it is reflective of that, in the sense that it is just core compliance issues that were completely disregarded. And everything else you mentioned is just as pressing. The OpenAI stuff is honestly baffling to some extent. I remember waking up and being like, okay, Sam Altman's joining Microsoft, and then, okay, now he's back, and you have all the employees threatening to walk out. That just goes to show a board that's out of touch, really, with what the company is actually trying to do. But they're fortunate that it resolved itself the way it did, because it could have gotten really dicey there from an employee perspective. And then the FCPA stuff, that's something that I was really looking forward to getting into, because I know you're the FCPA guy. I think it's great to talk about that. So we had the enforcement actions against Ticers and H.W. Wood. And I actually, going into this podcast, the week that we're recording this, Nicole Argentieri gave what I thought is a must-read speech for any compliance officer. Really interesting stuff about some of the things the DOJ are doing. But one of the things that stuck with me from her speech was that she mentioned how the voluntary self-disclosure that Jardine Lloyd Thompson Group made that earned them a declination in 2022 was what essentially led the DOJ to bring its cases against Ticers and H.W. Wood. And I think that's fascinating from the perspective of, we think if companies come forward and they voluntarily self-disclose and they bring information on employees, the DOJ is going to go after those individuals. But in this case, the DOJ went after those individuals, and those individuals gave them the information to go after the companies. And so you have that trickle-down effect. And I thought that was really fascinating to read on how, one, this is the way I put it, one company's voluntary self-disclosure, 2 companies' FCPA settlements. Trickle-down effect.
That's a great point, Kyle. Typically, we don't see multiple actions involving one set of facts outside the antitrust realm. because of the antitrust section's unique first reporting pass that they would give companies. And there's usually a cartel or some other group of companies involved. But here we had one set of facts leading to multiple FCPA actions. And the lesson I drew, Kyle, was that as a CCO, you need to be aware of what your competitors are doing and those in your industry, even if they're not your competitors, because both of those reinsurers should have been on notice immediately and run, not walked, to the Department of Justice to try to get in as quickly as they could after their competitor, who was doing the same thing with the same people in the same place, got in trouble. The second point, Kyle, and we don't talk about this, I think, enough, which is outside the United States, insurance is regulated by every country. In the United States, it's regulated on the state level. So we have, in Texas, we have a State Department of Insurance, et cetera, and literally every state has one of those. But outside the United States, it's a minister level. And if you get involved in robbery and corruption outside the United States in insurance, it's probably going to be at least have FCPA implications. And that's been true as long as since I became aware of this in December 2008 for the Aon FCPA enforcement action. If you're in insurance, you need to pay attention to all of your contacts with the foreign government officials in the former Department or Ministry of Insurance in foreign countries. So a lot to be learned, the self-disclosure issue, and that really ties into what I saw in the declination of Lifecore Biometrics. And here, the DOJ specifically called out that literally within hours of completing their internal investigation, they self-disclosed to the Department of Justice. And it sent the clear message that self-disclosure may be the most important thing. It's certainly top of mind for DOJ. I recognize there are 4 components to receiving a declination: extensive cooperation, extensive remediation, and profit disgorgement. But it all begins with self-disclosure. So once again, and in her speech, she emphasized the need for speed and self-disclosures, which means the need for speed in your reporting, internal reporting process, your internal triage process, your internal investigative process, your decision-making process at the board and at the senior executive level. You really need to get ahead of these because obviously Lifecore Biometrics and Jardine are prime candidates of what happens, what can happen if you do self-disclose.
Yeah, and I picked up on the exact same thing, Tom. I posted on my LinkedIn, had read the Jardine, the Lifecore declination, and I said, talk about a high bar for self-disclosure. Hours after the internal investigation found evidence of misconduct, and that's the expectation now. If you've seen what's worked for another company, that's it, and that's a hard bar to meet.
The bar used to be 2 weeks because that was Cognizant Technologies, and now it's literally hours. The need for speed is here.
Yeah, I guess in 5 years from now, the DOJ might as well be in the room when you get the findings. It's basically the what we're heading toward. And like I mentioned, if you haven't had a chance to our listeners, if you haven't had a chance to read Nicole Argentieri's speech from this week, it's on the DOJ's website. Really interesting stuff I thought there as well as to how the DOJ reached the penalty decisions it did make with Albemarle and some of the other FCPA settlements. I think actually both the Tytzers and HW were the ones as well. They broke down into those what individual thresholds were met to get the sentencing that those companies got, and also some really interesting stuff too on how the DOJ is using data analytics and how they plan to continue using data analytics. And there's some examples of a case that they brought against an individual. That's one that I've read it, I've written off it, and I plan to continue writing off of it because it's the type of speech that really I think sets the tone for what the DOJ is doing right now, what they're focusing on, and where they're going moving forward.
Kyle, you're absolutely spot on in my opinion. And when I read that, my first thought was we're going to move from data analytics and data-driven compliance from cutting edge to best practices to table stakes. And we're probably at best practices right now, but it won't be in a year or so where it's simply going to be, if you don't have a data analytics component to your compliance program, it will be deemed insufficient as a matter of law.
And it's always going to come down to if the DOJ comes looking and they ask about it and your answer is we don't do that, it's going to be the wrong answer. You have to at least be making an effort. And that's, I
Right.
think, where the department's expectations have always been, and that's especially where they are right now.
Kyle, if we could, I'd like to turn to something we have certainly presaged in prior episodes. We've talked about it. You have finally started writing about it, and it is, of course, inside the mind of the CCO survey and your report and analysis of it. I'm not quite sure where to begin, except that CCOs seem to be as happy as any other corporate group in their job. I hope I got that. But you want to take it from there, just go where you want to.
Yeah, and thanks, Tom. I mean, I love talking about this survey. It's one of the highlights of the year for us at Compliance Week every year. It's really, honestly, what gives us the foundation of what we do in the year to come. This is our way of getting to the heart of what our audience is most focused on and what they're most thinking about. And that's one of the things that, I mean, we've done this survey 5 years now, and every year we've done it. We just ask the question, do you like your job? Yes or no? And every year among compliance professionals, it's always a high response rate of yes, especially among CCOs. I think this year was 96%. And we wrote, actually, we had our freelancer, Amy Bond, write a story a couple years ago. Is compliance the happiest profession in America? Could it be? And it certainly is up there in the sense that you get a lot of opportunities to do the right thing in the compliance position. And I think that's what the position attracts, and that's what the position brings out of the people who are in it. So I'm never too surprised to see that high positivity rate. But I think the interesting thing this year is you juxtapose that positivity rate against where we ask the question, what's your biggest concern on the job? And every year we've done the survey, the previous 4 years we've done it, the biggest concern is always resource support. That would be no surprise to anybody. That is always a concern for compliance officers. But this year, for the first time, it was by 1%, but for the first time, the number one concern was keeping pace with regulations. And I think that is really, I'm not surprised that this is the year that would happen, just with everything that's going on with the DOJ and how active they've been in making corporate enforcement changes, how active the SEC has been. Earlier this year, we had, I think, nearly 40 rules that were in the final rulemaking stage. And going beyond the United States and looking globally, we have all these geopolitical tensions, all these growing sanctions, all of these regulators that are collaborating more, working together. That was another big thing in Nicole Argentieri's speech, is how the DOJ is increasing its collaborative efforts on anti-bribery. So I think I wasn't too surprised to see that. But I do think it says a lot about the compliance profession that despite all of these odds stacked against you and all of these different things you have to balance, 96% of these people still love their jobs. I mean, and I think that that's what this profession really brings out of the people who work in it. Is it really, it takes your A game every single day, but it's incredibly fulfilling from that perspective. Those are the things that I pulled out as the kind of high level takeaways from the survey. But we did some really interesting stuff this year too, in tailoring the survey to some of what we thought were the storylines and topics that a lot of compliance professionals talked about this year. And so we did some individual looks down on off-channel communications, artificial intelligence, and then continued progress on sustainability related disclosures. All those stories are on our site. Some really interesting stuff around some of those topics and getting an idea as to how compliance officers feel about them. It's not, none of these topics are, there's not a consensus really on any of them. Some people really think that they've got these things nailed down, or that they think that they're in the right on whether it's implementing AI or whatever it is. And then you have a lot of others who are playing it really safe and playing it really hesitant. And I've heard that a lot about both AI use and off-channel communications and the new expectations from the DOJ there. So I think it was really great to be able to pull that data out and pick that apart a little bit.
Kyle, I was either a little surprised or maybe even a little disappointed about the off-channel communications for the following reason. There was actually a presentation at Compliance Week, which I thought laid out, as well as I have heard, and indeed I interviewed the speaker for a podcast afterwards, on how to think about off-channel communication. And his point was, this is a risk. And if you see it as a risk, then you put together a risk management strategy to manage the risk. It starts with a risk assessment, and you put a strategy together, then you monitor it. Certainly would include a technology solution, and there are companies that can provide that now. And then you train on the policies and procedures, you monitor your employees, and you upgrade as appropriate. And I guess I've tried to communicate that message. It may be a high risk, it may be a difficult risk, but compliance professionals have faced other risks, and they've overcome those challenges. So I don't know if it's the survey was far enough back where people weren't really thinking about that or hearing the message, but it certainly seems to be front of mind and an ongoing concern for compliance professionals.
Yeah, and I think it's a problem that plays itself out very differently at every business. It depends on your geographic footprint. It depends on your industry and really your employee base. What is the age range of your employees? We know the younger generation, they live on these off-channel apps. They communicate primarily through WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or Instagram. And God forbid you give them a phone call because they're not going to know how to answer their phone. They just don't use those things. And so those are all the aspects that really, I think, have created a lot of hesitancy among compliance officers. And to be able to say, we want to make sure we do this right, and we want to make sure we grasp this, but we can't fathom the full extent of this. And I think especially the companies with wide geography, because you think in countries like Brazil, that's all they use is WhatsApp for communication. In a country like China, they use WeChat. And so you need to be able to understand those platforms and be able to wrap your head around it. And I think that's where a lot of the hesitation has come in. But I do think you're right. These surveys are always a snapshot in time. And some of the things that we found among our results is that a lot of firms are trying to figure it out internally right now. Very few said that they were using external resources, whether that be engaging with a vendor for monitoring or archiving or whatever it might be. Most of them are relying on their internal policies and procedures. And one of the things that really stuck out is most of them do not have a lot of confidence in those internal policies and procedures. They have them in place, but are the employees actually following them? That's the issue. So it's not so much that the policies aren't written. It's just more of how do we make sure that they're actually being listened to. And I think that's going to be a significant challenge in the years ahead. For financial services firms, they've already had to do that. And we've already seen that they clearly weren't doing that. And now that's why 40 something of them have been fined by the SEC and CFTC. But firms regulated by the DOJ, that's the issue they're facing right now. And once again, if the DOJ comes looking and they ask about it, you can't say you're not doing anything. You got to be able to put a little bit of effort in toward it. So that's where I think a lot of firms are at right now. And I think if we were to ask the same question next year, the results would be very different. Most likely, I think firms would be a little more further in progress or starting to figure out maybe how they can do it.
Kyle, I wanted to ask, other than inside the mind of the CCO survey report and analysis that Compliance Week will continue to do in December, are there any sort of year-end wrap-ups or other stories that you and your team will be coming out with this month that we can look forward to?
Yeah, we have a sort of annual package we always put together at the end of the year where we start to review some of the sort of notable storylines from the previous year. We start to look ahead to 2024. We have our annual compliance fails, our annual compliance triumphs, where we call out the biggest blunders and the biggest sort of accomplishments in the space. Those are always popular. It's just a great way to just get that recap of the major stories from the year. So we'll have all that together. Like you mentioned, we're still pulling together content from our Inside the Mind section. One story I'm really excited about, it's going to be publishing soon. I'm sure by the time this podcast is posted, it'll be up, is we've noticed over several years of doing the survey that we always ask, what job do you aspire to? And the number one job is chief compliance officer, because we pull all at levels of compliance. But when you look at the results among chief compliance officers, there's a lot that are striving to make the board. And I think that's really something that is a goal for a lot of chief compliance officers, is can I make my way to the board? And so that's a story that we're going to have coming, basically a sort of breakdown on what the path is from CCO to board member. And I know in conversations I've had with compliance practitioners, there's a lot of interest in getting to that level of an organization. So we'll have some good stuff on all that. We're also really breaking down some of the stuff that, like I said, it was a busy November. And so when we have all those things going down, those big enforcement actions, we take a lot of time to look through the documents and really make sure that we're pulling out all the relevant compliance lessons. We're still doing that with Bianace. We're still doing that with some of these FCPA actions. And we expect to continue pushing at all that. And we're also keeping an eye on the fact that the Supreme Court might take out the SEC's in-house courts. And that's going to have some significant ramifications from an enforcement perspective.
Kyle, let's now turn to the world of sports. And we had finally some innovation from the National Basketball Association in the context, or in the form rather, of an in-season tournament. I have to say I was a little skeptical when it was announced, but I'm completely on board now. And not only has the NBA as an institution embraced it, but what impressed me and what sold me, Kyle, was the players embraced it. and literally players from LeBron James and his stature all the way down to players on the Orlando Magic, Indiana Pacers, Houston Rockets. And they view this as an opportunity to be showcased, to shine, and to win something. And the enthusiasm level has just really stunned me. I haven't been a big fan of these ticky-tacky courts they've painted up, but maybe I'm just an old white guy and I need to get with the program. But I can't wait till next week when the Final Four hit Las Vegas. I know you're a longtime Celtics fan. I think you covered the Celtics at some point. What are your thoughts about this in-season tournament? And was it just a marketing ploy? But it was a marketing ploy that worked.
Yeah, it's definitely a marketing ploy, and especially when you think about those courts, man. Some of those are really an eyesore. But if your eyes are getting sore from looking at it, your eyes are still on it, and that's what they were looking for, is for people to be paying attention. I think we're seeing all the sports do this right now. The cable rates are declining. People aren't watching TV like they used to. And so you have to come think outside the box. We're seeing MLB take a lot of very drastic measures to make sure that their games are crisper, more lean, more easily to watch. And then NFL's been doing some really innovative stuff as well with these slime games on Nickelodeon and all that type of stuff. I think it's not too surprising to see it all come together, but I'm not too surprised in the sense that the players have started to buy in. I know there was some skepticism toward it at the beginning of the season, but these are competitive guys. You are not a professional athlete unless you are a competitive person. And so if you're going to put something on the line and say you're competing against teams for a certain title and a certain recognition and that platform, then they're going to get amped up and they're going to play to that. And I think it's great. You want to feel like when you're watching an NBA game, everyone is out there giving it their all. And that's not the way sports go every time. Sometimes you feel that kind of phoned in aspect of it. And I think that's been one of the great side effects of this. Yes, the NBA is doing it for the money and for the attention, of course. But if the players are going out there bringing their A game and the fans are buying into that and the fans are getting into it, and then I think everybody wins with it. Tom, I think you're on mute.
I can't think of anything before this year that was more irrelevant than an NBA game in November and December up to Christmas Day. Christmas Day on the NBA, for the longest time, that was the NBA's day. And they used to feature one game, and I'm old enough that it always was the Celtics and Sixers, which was great in the late 70s and 80s, early 80s.
Warriors and the Lakers.
Yeah, but then it became 5 games. But the NBA has made itself relevant. And I actually thought back to, I think last year, when the World Cup was moved to December because they were playing in Qatar and they couldn't play in the summer because of the heat. And I absolutely loved it because it brought world-class soccer, or as my wife would call it, football, to midweek before NFL games. And back then we didn't have it in NBA tournament. It was top-notch sports during the week in December. Obviously no baseball. So I'm really enjoying this sort of different types of strategies that all of the leagues are employing, and they're trying something new. And in baseball's case, probably the first time in 100 years, but even the NBA. So I applaud the effort. I applaud the players. You're right. They play pinochle on planes for big dollars just because they're that competitive. And you only need to look at Michael Jordan to see how all that manifests. But I really enjoyed it. And like I said, I can't wait till we get to the Final Four in Las Vegas next week. As I recall, you're not that big of a college football fan. It may have something to do about the
It's
part
where
of the
I
world
live. It's because I live
you
in
live
Boston.
in.
There is no college football over here.
But I grew up in Texas, then I went to Michigan, and Michigan beat Ohio State. Number 2 played number 3. But what struck me was, and a lot of commentators said, as great as it was an event that you occasionally see in college football towards the end of the year, when you get high-ranking teams play each other in a conference, and it's incredibly meaningful. And that meaning may end next year because the playoffs are going to expand to 12 teams. Right now, if you don't have an undefeated record, you're probably not going to make the Final Four NCAA football playoff teams. So I wanted to really ask you about the kind of spectacle and having the game of the century, at least this year's version of the game of the century. And are we going to lose something by gaining something else in the form of a college football 12-team playoff?
Isn't it funny that we always have game of the century every year, and we just don't call it the game of the year. We always have to be so hyperbolic with some of that stuff. And I will say, I went to Emerson College, which does not have a football team at all, and they sell the shirts Emerson College football undefeated since 1886. They just don't mention the fact that they've never played a game in that time. So that is about my grasp on college football from the perspective of that background and growing up around it. But I did follow it and I did cover it for a period of time in my time at ESPN. And yeah, that's definitely an aspect when it comes to playoff expansion. And now we've seen this in other leagues as well, where they're trying to get more teams into the mix at the end of the season. And it does take away from some of the in-season drama. That said, they feel the balance is now we've got more teams in playoff scenarios, those do or die scenarios. So we're losing the in-season drama a little bit, but we're gaining more postseason drama. But I think the tough thing with losing the in-season drama is a lot of that in-season drama is among these long-time rivals, and especially when it comes to the end of the slate and you're starting to play in the conference tournaments and all that stuff. So that's where I think the sting is going to be lost a little bit, is you might have these high-drama games, but they might be between teams that just don't quite have that history between them, like Michigan and OSU. That, I think, is going to be something that's going to be missed, especially in a sport like college football where the fan bases are diehard and they have nothing but disdain for their rivals. There's so much on the line in those games. You can see it in the way the fans storm the field and everything like that afterward. So that's going to be, I think, something the sport's going to miss. It's hard to replicate that, but they're going to say we're going to have more dramatic postseason games or college football playoff games. And that's what I think they're more leaning toward.
Kyle, for our final topic in our sports segment, I wanted to visit with you about the termination or firing of Carolina Panthers coach Frank Reich by owner David Tepper in a rare in-season termination of a head coach. This will be the third firing of a head coach literally in 3 years by David Tepper. He's, I believe, the newest NFL owner, and he came from, I think, private equity, but perhaps investment. Nevertheless, a very wealthy, very successful individual in his prior career. And literally every time we have a new owner, they make misstep after misstep. And the last great example I would point to is Steve Ballmer, who also has more money than most deities and spent it at the LA Clippers, for his LA Clippers, who have done nothing with the money he spent on them, at least in terms of playoff victories. Here, the question I have is football culture like a corporate culture? Can you change a culture? Is it about culture? What's the role of the owner? Should they set the culture, put people in place and let them run with it? You have people you report to, I know, but you're the EIC and you're given latitude to work within the culture that's set by the folks above you. So I was wondering if maybe what your thoughts are on David Tepper's role as the owner, not so much Frank Reich or missteps around the drafting of Bryce Young or any of those, but really how should an owner approach the ownership of an NFL team?
Yeah, and you related it to myself very briefly there as an editor-in-chief. And yes, I do have individuals that I report to, but I, at the end of the day, am the person who dictates the editorial strategy for Compliance Week. That's my job, and that's what they expect me to do. And the fact that there's that expectation and those clear lines are drawn is what works for us as an organization, as a media organization, because if ownership is calling the shots, then they're not expected to understand the audience like I am. And so there's that where those issues might come in. But I do think in the NFL realm, it's a little similar. If you are hiring a coach, the expectation should be that they will set the tone for the football culture of the organization. And if you're not looking for the right people if you don't think that they're going to do that. And I think that especially think of Carolina's current situation, and they've got this young quarterback that they took number 1 overall in the draft, and they really they see as the future of their franchise. Those players benefit so much from structure and consistency, especially because it is very difficult to make that transition from college to the pros. So you think about what they need to go right, and they're not quite feeding into that. And I would say, just from my viewpoint and as a sports observer, a former sports reporter, and as someone who's been a member of an organization with those sort of tiered structures in place, the owner's job is not to set that football culture. Of course, you want them to, the same way you would structure a sort of any organizations. You want the CEO to be a beacon in some way, shape, or form, or the owner or whatever you have. But you want the people who are on the ground, the people who truly understand what they're doing, to set the tone. It's the same with the compliance department. It's the chief compliance officer should be the one sort of setting the tone for the department. But that's the way I view it. And you're right. I don't think it's necessarily football culture changing. I do think some of these owners maybe come in with their ideas of what they want to do, or their sort of viewpoints on what is tolerable and what isn't. But at the end of the day, you need to be thinking long term with these hires. And you can see it on some of the teams that are the most successful in the league right now. Their coaches were brought in at a time when the organization was at a low, but they were given the time to build it back up. And every time that you hit restart, it sets everyone back off to zero. And it's something that I think if Carolina's going to dig itself out of where it's at, they need to find someone that they can invest in long term and give them the runway to build the organization the way they want to build it and the way they want to coach it. Because if not, they're just going to have people continue to inherit what the other person left, and you're not going to get anywhere that way.
Kyle, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. I wanted to thank our audience for visiting with us. I hope everyone has a great holiday season. I hope you will join us again in 2024. I am your co-host, Tom Fox.
I'm Kyle Brasseur. Thanks for having me, Tom. Happy holidays, everybody.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of From the Editor's Desk. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. From the Editor's Desk is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.